Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Spinner. I am a USA Today bestselling author and a high school English teacher. And on this week's episode, we're not talking to a Four Corners author, but her most recent book was published by Artemisia Publishing here in New Mexico, and that is how I came across her book. So today we'll be talking to Leah Holbrook Sackett about her book, Death is a Hungry Angel. Leah, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Leah Holbrook Sackett, and I'm an author. This is my sixth book, Death is a Hungry Angel, and I am also an instructor in English at the University of Missouri St. Louis and at the St. Louis Community College at Merrimack.
Awesome. So a fellow educator as well. I'm sure that'll come back up in the conversation. Always interesting to see other perspectives, especially from like public education to higher ed and different things. So we'll get back to that. But before I get off topic, tell us a little bit about Death is a Hungry Angel.
Death is a Hungry Angel is really about grief. It is about Anna, a 14-year-old girl who has lost her little sister in a tragic accident, and her family moves into an abandoned funeral home from the turn of the century. And it's haunted by a corrupted angel of death who has been bound there by the previous owner through some misbegotten magic. And Anna has to confront the angel of death and fight for herself and her mother's survival.
And with this one of the things that stood out to me was your setting, because setting is really important to the story. As you mentioned, they move into what used to be a fairly thriving, I guess you wouldn't really call it like mortuary. It would be like the more modern term, but what they...
it was like called a death hospital back at the turn of the century, but it's more like a funeral home is what you would call it now.
Yeah, it was really interesting because I didn't know a lot about like the practices at that time period. And so I'm sure you must have done like a lot of research into all of this and what that was like back then. And,
Yes.
and we'll get into the different timelines as well in a second. But yeah, tell me a little bit about how you built the setting for this story, because it really anchors everything that the characters go through.
Well, I got the idea from my great-grandmother owned a house that had been a funeral parlor, and she turned it into a boarding house. And I just thought that was creepy. And that's what gave me the idea for the history of the house being a death hospital get turned into a home.
And as far as like the practices and how death was handled at that time, because there wasn't a lot of technology, there weren't the same chemicals and processes and reconstructive abilities to like make people look nice in the ways. It's amazing what they can do today. It's kind of crazy. How much did you have to dig into all of those different practices and like what would have been done around the turn of the century for people who have passed?
Yeah, I had to do a lot of research on old practices for preparing bodies for burial and the chemicals that they used, processes they went through. The fact that they would, at a death hospital, would sit with the dead to make sure that they were in fact dead before they buried them, and that they would bury them with ribbons tied to bells at the surface, so that way if you woke up in a coffin, you could ring for help.
It's just such a crazy thing to think about that that really did unfortunately happen to people. And
happened enough that they had a plan for it.
Yeah. And like such a basic part of existence that you die. And it's just so weird to think like sometimes they couldn't quite tell if you were dead or not.
Yes.
And like, oh my gosh, how scary to be like getting sick and you're like, oh gosh, I really hope that they wait until I'm like dead before they bury me. That's awful.
I found that very interesting, and when I was doing my research, and I thought, oh, this has to go into the story because that is just unreal. That was a common practice.
Yeah, it gives you a lot of perspective on how far we come and how we think about and treat death now. Those cultural practices have shifted in significant ways, I'd say. Now, with this one, obviously death is a big theme in the book. And you mentioned earlier that it's about grief as well. And so I wanted to ask you about your characters, because you have Anna But you also have the timeline of Beverly through a good portion of the book as well. And that can be a little bit hard to balance when you're working with different timelines. But what I also noticed about your characters is how different they were. And that can also be really challenging to not have multiple points of views start kind of sounding the same as you're working through it. So tell us about your process for developing your characters and to making them both so unique from each other.
Well, having them set 100 years apart from each other helped to distinguish the voices of the main characters. Beverly starts off as a child born into this death hospital situation and what that would be like growing up in a home where she's the only child, and only visitors that come to the home are people who are grieving and mourning. And then Anna, she is typical 14-year-old girl interested in her first kiss and her peers and celebrities and fashion, and she finds herself grieving over the accidental death of her younger sister. So she's actually in the grieving process, whereas Beverly was just raised around the grieving process and how it impacts them differently.
Yeah, because you really see the difference in their perspective surrounding death, where you have...
Yes, Beverly's comfortable with death. Death is her playmate, and the angel of death is her playmate. And whereas Anna is not comfortable with death, and she is tired of death, taking over her life.
And I noticed too, in addition to that, the usefulness of death. And from the perspective of a young girl growing up in the hospital, she saw how it was a source of income and how it could be used almost like as a source of control in some ways. And so that as you see her timeline and her kind of growing up and progressing with that in combination of having this angel of death as a kind of secret playmate, it creates a really interesting worldview that then you contrasted with Anna, who is a normal girl in the modern world who, her views probably reflect most other readers and how they think about and view death, and that, losing someone is a very hard thing and it's a process to work through. And just that contrast between the two characters I found really intriguing. And I wanted to ask you, how much did you plan out before you write as far as their arcs and their development and those details? And how much developed organically as you were writing? Because everybody kind of has a different process on whether they outline or how much, or detailed character profiles versus you start with a kernel and kind of move forward. So what is that like for you?
It's more organic. I start with a scene usually, how I visualize the character in a particular scene, and I start with that, and then it just kind of tells itself as I go on. They definitely grow organically. I'm not much of a outliner when it comes to my stories, and I think that was actually helpful to me in weaving the different narratives together, that I wasn't constricted by this has to happen by this certain point in time, but as the characters actually naturally developed, that's how the plot was put into place.
I think with a topic like this that is difficult to discuss in a lot of ways, but also there's a wide variety across the world of how death is viewed, what grief is, and whether, it should be hidden or displayed, or if it's a personal thing or a community thing. There's really a lot of variety across cultures for how death is viewed. And I think that would have been really hard to say, I'm going to do it with these specific things in mind, and I'm going to make the story work with that. I like that you explored as you were writing this and let all of that kind of develop and meld together as you went.
Yeah, and I started with the characters of Beverly and Anna as my focus, but the mother became a main character as well, for how she was dealing with her grief of the loss of a child. But she's still a mother, and the struggles that she had to be there for Anna while she was so deep in her own grief with with Abby passing. And so I liked the juxtaposition of Anna's grief and her mother's grief, how they were dealing with it, and yet they only had each other to rely on. but they were being torn apart by their grief.
Yeah, everybody experiences that so differently. And it is a very personal process, but when you're reliant on other people, and especially a parent child relationship where it's like you're trying to deal with what you've got going on, but also like you still have to take care of another human being, that gets complicated because, where are those lines to be able to say, like, no, I need this and I need to be able to process it in this way, but you're also trying to navigate how someone else is processing their grief. Like, I think you showed the complexities of that really well, and that it's not just something like, okay, you think like stages of grief, and that makes it sound like it's a simple process. Like we move from stage to stage and then we're done. We grieved. It's like, it doesn't work like that really.
Yes, I was familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the work that she did with the 5 stages of grief, and how it's not a linear progression, and that you definitely do go through these different stages of acceptance and bargaining, and it's just how Anna and her mother move through the stages differently, but yet they're both in the same grief process.
Well, and then you add in Anna's father as well, which he's not present for the majority of the book, but that in itself, it really kept him present in the reader's mind. I felt like, even though he's not on the page, I was often thinking about the dad, and just like he just left them there to deal with all this on their own. And so like, even though he's not there, you're also thinking about and exploring the way he's dealing with grief, which is to just avoid it, basically, to run away
Yes.
and not have to deal with anyone else's grief because he doesn't know how to deal with his own either, which was a fascinating layer to this as well.
Thank you.
Well, and so one of the other things that I wanted to chat with you about, going back to research where we started, as far as your rules, because there is obviously a paranormal-ish element to it, however you want to classify that.
Yeah.
And there's some like established belief or lore, and then there's always that room to kind of make it your own so it fits with the story. How much of that did you research and stick to strictly with one belief system or another? And then what parts did you mesh together with what you needed in the story?
I pulled from my background, my childhood. I was raised Catholic, and so it has a Catholic basis to it, about the traditions of death and the beliefs of what happens after you die, and that an angel of death comes and escorts you essentially to the afterlife. So that was a pretty strict rule for the book, that was the case. But then I did research on how Egyptian cultures dealt with death, how other religions deal with death, and I worked those in as needed in order to further the plot line of the story.
And you brought in some interesting things, some of it that I had never heard of before. The hair wreaths I thought were
Yes.
fascinating. I had to stop and like Google that, and I was like, what is she talking about? I hadn't heard that before. And what? And from my perspective, odd, but interesting practice. I hadn't heard of that before. And that was something I was just like, who thought of doing that in the first place? Like, what an unusual path to take. But I guess, when it's something you're not familiar with.
It was popular in Victorian times that they did that. And I kept the practice alive for the small town that this occurs in, that back during Beverly's time, that this was still a relic that was kept around, people requesting the hair wreaths to be made of the deceased person. And I've seen some, and they are intricate, and I mean, you would not believe that it was human hair that they were working with.
Yeah, when I looked him up, I thought, oh, those are beautiful. I wouldn't want one in my house necessarily.
No, I wouldn't want one either.
But again, it was just really interesting to see those little details you put in that added richness to the story, and just showed that, everybody approaches this topic in their own way. And I liked as well the way that the Angel of Death interacts with the different characters. because he takes different forms and he has different relationships with both Beverly and then later with Anna. And you get to kind of see different sides of him and where he's at in his progression, because he's not a static character in the sense of he's just this angel of death and he's one thing and that's it, because he's kind of got this progression as well. So tell us a little bit about him and how you developed him.
Yeah, I thought, as an angel of death, sees one side of life, and he's always at the end of a person's life, and he escorts them on to the afterlife. And I thought, what if, an angel of death became bored with this and became gluttonous, and instead of delivering the souls to the afterlife, he fed upon them. And that's what this angel of death starts to do. And he becomes corrupted by doing that. And Beverly, when she runs into the problems of the death hospital being outdated and shuttering her family business is failing, she realizes that her childhood playmate and her love is going to have to move on to another place to collect these souls. And so she performs a magic spell that she derives from looking at books that she has in her family history of death traditions. And she botches the spell, and what she winds up doing is binding the angel of death to the house so he cannot leave. But then he also is starving because he has no more souls to collect. And then he sees his opportunity for escape from this when Anna moves into the house. If he could get her to redo the spell correctly, that it would free him of his servitude as an angel of death, and he could become a human and have all the responsibilities and rights and freedoms and opportunities that humans have that he as an angel of death does not get to share in.
And that brings up a great topic that I also wanted to discuss. When you are developing characters, you think a lot about their motivation and what is, propelling them through this story. Why are they dealing with the challenge? Where does this come from? And I thought with these three characters, with Samuel and Anna and Beverly, they all have really different motivations that are driving them, but all connected to death. And it gets tangled up in really interesting ways, especially being 100 years apart in the two storylines. But the way you develop them really showed, I think, the importance of knowing what your character wants and why they want it, because that really affects the decisions that they make and how the story is going to move forward. So I was curious as far as like your exploration of your characters, and as you're writing, and you mentioned you're more of an organic writer, you don't outline or do like super detailed character profiles, which for some people can be like several pages long. When you were starting with these characters, how much of their inner motivation did you like already have kind of conceptualized as you were starting the story? And then how did you blend those differing motivations together?
Yes, I did see distinctly the differences between their motivations. Beverly's motivation is love, and as messed up as that love might be, whereas Anna's motivations are she's young and she wants to be young and she's just discovering life. And it's been her sister's death that she can't enjoy these coming of age opportunities and times because she's been forced into this grief experience. And she but yeah, so she has very different motivations. She wants to get back to living, but that makes her feel guilty. And so her motivations are very different from Beverly's. Beverly's trying to survive a time shift in time and advances in how you deal with death. And Anna's trying to survive just being forced into living in the realm of grief while she wants to be young and vivacious. So their motivations are definitely different. What they're trying to get out of their relationship with death.
Well, and Death himself, Samuel the angel, he also like you mentioned, he wants to have kind of a different experience. He's done this for, who knows how long. He gets bored. He wants to have a different experience. And it made me think about, like, what would that be like if your existence is just perpetually dealing with people's last moments and seeing the end of life, but never actually getting to experience it yourself. Like, even though he's, really kind of the villain in this story, you give him some elements where you can relate to that. You can understand, like, how he got to the point that he got, with kind of being like, well, I'm just doing the same thing over and over. What's it serving? And he kind of gets selfish and wants to serve himself instead, and then gets curious about these other experiences. And there are always, like, certain stories that you read and the villain antagonist stands out because you kind of, in some ways, are like, yeah, I get it. And to me, that's always like a mark of an antagonist that is really well thought out and developed, because you want there to be that certain element that the reader can say, yeah, they're not like 100% evil. No, I don't want them to succeed, but there's this level of understandability in either how they got to the point they got to or why they want what they want. And I think that's something that can be quite challenging in a lot of cases, because sometimes the antagonist is just viewed as, the obstacle that the hero or the protagonist needs to overcome. And I think sometimes that oversimplifies the villain, and then that doesn't ring as true to the reader as it could. And so I wanted to ask you kind of your approach as far as how you viewed him as a character and the depth that you put into his character. Like, what's that process like compared to Anna's character, who is more the protagonist that we're rooting for, and we want her to be safe and survive and work through her grief over time?
Well, I didn't want Death to be an evil character. It's his trade to be an angel of death, and that is a part of life, and it's not evil because someone dies, even though we don't want that. There's an acceptance we have to come to with it. So I wanted Death to be a dark character, and he becomes a selfish character after he gets a taste of what living is like through his relationship with Beverly, and he wants more of that. And he, tries to seduce Anna into helping him achieve that. But he's wanting more for himself than being just a angel that serves man. At their last hour, he wants to experience life, and I felt that doing that made Death less of a evil character and more of a complex character that had his own motivations and his own temptations that he was battling with.
I like that. I think factoring in all of those different aspects of a character, really important for both sides of that protagonist-antagonist relationship, and especially when they, match up nicely and make sense and come together to help develop your theme further. Nicely done. Awesome.
And I wanted Anna to have something to fight against. When you experience death, you wish you just had something you could hit, something that you could fight and, save the person that you love. But, making death personified gave Anna someone that she could pit her will against and act out her grief and her anger by having a relationship with death than it being an abstract concept that she's grappling with it, but she's grappling with a person.
Well, and I think for your target age group with this, I think that's really helpful because it's a hard concept to understand and process when you're a young person dealing with grief and death for the first time. It's easier, I think, in a story form to kind of get these ideas across when there's something to actually interact with and help kind of work through maybe the ideas that a person is thinking or the feelings that they're experiencing, and can be really hard to like name and quantify, and you're just like, oh, this all just feels terrible. What do I do with it? That's not easy, but I liked that this kind of gave I think a framework to think about some of these more complicated, hard to work through on your own issues and make it hopefully a little bit more manageable in some way of thinking about how you process grief and what you might face going through it. 'Cause again, everybody's a little bit different, but you have some really relatable aspects here that I think will speak to people who are going through grief and trying to find their own path as they deal with it.
Anna, going through Anna and Cynthia, her mother's grief was very much a cathartic process for myself. My brother had passed away from cancer, and I was dealing with my grief over his loss. And so I wrote the book as a way of trying to deal with the different stages of grief and how that impacts you to lose a sibling so close to you, that how you identify yourself in that person, and how you have, an identity crisis as well, and grieving at the loss of someone very close to you.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about your brother. That's not easy to deal with. I am glad that writing was a helpful experience for you in processing that as well.
Thank you.
Well, and that went by really quick. We are just about out of time, but before we wrap up, I did want to ask you about any future projects that you're working on that we can keep an eye out for.
I'm working on a coming-of-age novel of a young girl drop out of college who is sent to take care of a woman with dementia in a haunted house.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can get into there. Great. All right. Well, good luck with that. I think that's going to be some interesting themes to explore as well. And for people who are interested, where can they find you online? Or where can they locate the book if they would like to check it out some more and learn more about you and your writing?
You can find me at leahsackett.com, and you can get my book on just about anywhere, Amazon, Target, anywhere that sells books. You can find Death is a Hungry Angel and my other book. My other books are collections of short stories. Death is a Hungry Angel is my first novel, and you can reach me at leahsackett.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to come on the show today and chat with me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.